Last lecture, we made the case in favor of the documentary hypothesis. We will now make the conservative case against the documentary hypothesis. We're going to go through the 5 pillars of the documentary hypothesis and test each one of them to see how sound they actually are. First of all, some general remarks against the documentary hypothesis. The kind of cut and paste editing that Wellhausen assumed is unparalleled in literary history and is intrinsically unlikely. The documentary hypothesis has unrealistic assumptions about how consistent a writer must be. The documentary hypothesis assumes that a writer, 1, never makes a statement twice over, 2, never allows himself a digression, always sticks to the point, 3, never makes a statement that's difficult to reconcile with something else that he said, even in the smallest matter. Such assumptions are untrue of all writers of literature, ancient and modern. The documentary hypothesis assumes, moreover, that the editors were idiots. This, by the way, was the argument of my Jewish mentor, Hanan Brichto, at Hebrew Union College. He was not an Orthodox Jew by any means, but he totally rejected the documentary hypothesis. According to the theory, the redactors JE and redactor D and redactor P are said to have nothing to fix the contradictions of the documents that they put together. And so, if that's the case, they must have been pretty bad editors. Wellhausen assumes that J and E and P were completely self-consistent before being combined with the other sources by these mindless editors. So which is it? Were they really interested in consistency so that they never have contradictions? Or they were so inconsistent that they don't care one whit about any alleged contradictions? You can't really have it both ways. Wybrey comments on it this way. He says, thus the hypothesis can only be maintained on the assumption that while consistency was the hallmark of the various documents, inconsistency was the hallmark of the redactors. And I like to quote Wybrey because he's a liberal critic of the documentary hypothesis. He's not an Orthodox Christian, yet he found the theory to be wanting. This kind of editing, moreover, is unparalleled. There is no ancient Semitic literary work known to have evolved the way that Wellhausen said that the Pentateuch grew. Now, some have pointed to parallel in Syriac literature, Tatian's Diatessaron, which is a harmony of the 4 Gospels that was written in the 2nd century A.D., but it's not a particularly good analogy for several reasons. One, it was written centuries after the Pentateuch. It's Greek rather than Semitic culture, even though the language is Syriac. And after the rise of Greek and Roman history writing, which also changes the way that people write. Thirdly, he was taking texts which had already been canonized, whereas J and E and D presumably had not been canonized before they were incorporated. Another analogy could be with the Temple Scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wybrey brings this up. It has similar inconsistencies as the Pentateuch, though scholars attribute it to a single author rather than finding these hypothetical sources in the Dead Sea Scroll, Temple Scroll. And so that would be the better analogy that, well, authors don't always try to be completely consistent without digression and so forth. The Unity of theme around the patriarchal promise also suggests that mindless editing did not in fact take place. The promise to Abraham unifies the Pentateuch. And this theme of the promise of land and seed and blessing to Abraham and his seed occurs across Wellhausian source divisions. Hence, the editors seem to be something other than cut and paste collectors of materials, but something more like authors. The pillars of the documentary hypothesis, as it turns out, proved unsound upon testing. So let's test the various pillars. The first pillar is the divine names. Why do some passages in Genesis use Yahweh and other passages use Elohim? Umberto Cassuto, a Jewish scholar, gave this answer in contradistinction from the documentary hypothesis. He argued that the names are not interchangeable, but the name Yahweh will be used in certain types of contexts, and the name Elohim will be used in other types of contexts. That's because Yahweh is God's personal name, whereas Elohim is a title. You could translate it deity. And he argued that the difference in divine names had nothing to do with source documents, but simply had to do with what word was best used in a particular context. Yahweh is, as we said, God's personal name. God's personal name tends to be used when emphasizing personal and ethical attributes of God and what he requires. Yahweh is used of God in the context of covenant or personal faith, covenant having to do with personal relationships. And Yahweh is used when dealing personally with people. On the other hand, Elohim is a general term, could be translated deity. It's used of God as creator and source of life for the whole world. It's used of God with no special emphasis. It's used of God when you want to emphasize the transcendence of God, when he seems remote to people. And it'll be used of God on the lips of non-Israelites. Now, this distinction between Yahweh and Elohim largely explains the usage. So in Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation uses Elohim. Why? Because it emphasizes God as transcendent creator of the whole world, emphasizes that he is separate from creation. And since it's the whole world and not Israel, and it's transcendence rather than personal relationship that's emphasized, it will be this more general term, deity. But when you get to Genesis 2 and 3, you have the Garden of Eden narrative, and it switches to Yahweh Elohim. Why? Because Yahweh is used to emphasize personal or covenant dealings with people. Elohim is added because the text wants to teach that Yahweh is completely identical with Elohim of chapter 1, so there's no confusion. But since it switches to a more personal covenant context in chapters 2 and 3, it switches to the personal name Yahweh. When you get to Genesis 4, you have the story of Cain and Abel. It uses Yahweh. Why? Because it's emphasizing God's personal dealings with people. When you get to Genesis 5, you have the genealogy of Seth, and it switches to Elohim. Why? Because it's emphasizing God as creator of the whole world, with this allusion to Genesis chapter 1. When you get to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God and the daughters of men, it does use Yahweh. It mentions the sons of God, but it would be irreverent to mention the sons of Yahweh as if he begets deities. Yahweh is used in verse 3 because of God's personal strivings with man. Again, God in personal relationships will tend to be Yahweh. When you get to Genesis 6:5 through 9:17, the flood narrative, you do get this mixture of Yahweh and Elohim. This goes on to indicate that, well, in certain contexts, you can use the terms interchangeably, either God or Elohim. But in Genesis 9:22-27, it switches to Yahweh. That's the story of how Noah was treated badly by his son Ham. But anyway, it uses Yahweh in that section. Why? Because out of Shem comes Israel. And the use of the term Yahweh is to emphasize God's personal relationship with Shem's descendants. Out of Japheth, however, comes the nations, and hence it switches back to God when it refers to him, a more distant term, deity. Usage has a combination of theological and unconscious bias, though. This was the view of Wybray. He argued that, well, sometimes there could be a theological reason for choosing Yahweh versus Elohim, and so he largely agreed with Cassuto, as we've argued just now. And then sometimes there are stylistic reasons for choosing which term. Certain synonyms are not used interchangeably in a language, and it's not always clear why that would be so. You could say that your coffee is too strong, but you could never say that your coffee is too powerful. It's just not the way that you say it in English. There may be reasons that are hard to discern, hard to determine, that may be underlying why the author felt one term for God was appropriate in one place and a different term for God was appropriate in a different place. There may be even unconscious reasons for doing so. Even professors of the Old Testament sometimes refer to God as Yahweh, or sometimes refer to God as the Lord, and sometimes refer to God as God. And they might not be able to tell you why they chose the one or the other term. Now, let's go back to that passage in Exodus 6, 2 through 4, the passage which seemed to indicate that the patriarchs didn't know the name Yahweh. And there's at least two ways of answering that objection. Gleason Archer, who was a teacher of mine, argued that did the patriarchs know the name Yahweh? Well, yes, they knew the name, but they didn't know the significance of the name. And hence, even though they knew the name, the verse in Exodus 6 that says that they knew me by El Shaddai, but they didn't know me by Yahweh. They knew the name itself, but they just didn't know the significance of it. That was Gleason Archer's attempt to explain this problem. I actually like another professor's interpretation better, Gordon Wenham. He argues they didn't know the name Yahweh. And that would explain why none of the personal names in Genesis have Yahweh as a part of the name. However, the narrator knows who Yahweh is. Let's assume the narrator is Moses. Well, he knew who Yahweh was. He had things explained to him in the book of Exodus. And so he can introduce references to Yahweh. Many of the references are on the lips of the narrator. And he will go out of his way to use that name in order to indicate that the patriarchal God, El Shaddai, was the same as the Yahweh that the Israelites came to worship after the Exodus. Now, you get an example of how this is working in Genesis 16 and verse 11, where it talks about Ishmael. Ishmael means El hears. But the narrator introduces Yahweh as an explanation. You shall call his name Ishmael because Yahweh has listened to your affliction. Well, clearly, originally, what it would have said would be, "You shall call his name Ishmael, because El has listened to your affliction." But Moses has introduced Yahweh here, the narrator, in order to indicate that the El that they worshipped in patriarchal times is none other than Yahweh. Under either explanation, Archer or Winham's, is not a matter of sources. Thus, the first pillar from the divine names proves to be unsound. Well, what about the second pillar? Well, let's test that one. That's language and style. The general response is, well, why couldn't an Israelite author vary his style and choice of words from passage to passage, depending on the purpose and message? Why couldn't he break up a lengthy story with a digression and not have been part of his style to have digressions rather than evidence of sources? Every time there's a digression, they say, oh, it must be a different source that he's citing here. But that is completely unnecessary. One can have variations in language and style without positing different authors. So the question, does different vocabulary demand different authors? Casuto, in his argument against the documentary hypothesis, argues that, like the divine names, some of these word pairs that are said to distinguish sources are not interchangeable at all, but some will be preferable in certain contexts, while others will be preferable in other contexts. So, for example, the difference between create and form. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. But then in Genesis 2, supposedly now going from P to J, it says Yahweh formed man from the dust of the earth. Why the switch from create to form? Well, bara is not used when mentioning material out of which something is created, whereas yatsar emphasizes the material out of which something is created. So if you want to say that God created man, as you say in Genesis 1:26, well, you'll use bara. Doesn't talk about material out of which man was created. But when you give the greater detail that he formed man from the dust of the earth, he switches to yatsar to emphasize the material. And hence the choice is based on what you want to say, not sources. Also, you have certain contexts where you have Amorite versus Canaanite for the people of the land, Canaan. Wybray suggests that these terms may have had connotations that now escape us, connotations that led to using different terms in different contexts. And we can't reproduce exactly what's going on in that particular case, but that doesn't mean that they must be different sources that use different terms for the people of the land. In the term cutting or establishing a covenant, another word pair that's used, well, the word to cut a covenant, karat, is used in Genesis 15:18 versus hakim, establish, in Genesis 17:2. Casuto makes the argument that these mean two different things. When you cut a covenant, you give certain assurances. For example, you make this covenant with me, I will do X, Y, and Z. So I'm making certain assurances when I cut a covenant. But when you establish a covenant, it means you fulfill what has been assured. You confirm a covenant. You give them the X, Y, or Z that you made when you karatted or cut a covenant. Or in other cases, it means renewing a covenant that's already been established. And so again, this different language does not mean that it must be a different source. Arguments from style can also be used against the documentary hypothesis. Wybray points out that P and J have identical styles. P has a style that's indistinguishable from J, other than the use of the divine name. This fact is generally unperceived, ignored, or implausibly explained away by writers on this subject, Whybray comments. Moreover, it's interesting that, P is said to be written after the exile. Much of it is written after the exile, during or after. During and after the exile, the Jewish people came to adopt Aramaic as their spoken language. But if P were really post-exilic, you would expect there to be Aramaism showing up in the language. But there are no Aramaisms in the so-called P documents of the Pentateuch. And this suggests that it probably isn't written after the exile. Thus, the second pillar also proves to be unsound. What about the third pillar, the pillar of contradictions? The general response is these alleged contradictions can usually be easily harmonized. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you have in Genesis 1, plants were made before man, but in Genesis 2, you have plants made after man. Is that a contradiction? In Genesis 2 and verse 5, it says that certain plants did not grow. The first plant, which is sikh, has to do with thorns. The second has to do with plants that require cultivation, like barley and grains. And only these are not created on the third day. Thorns and herbs were later part of the curse of man. Thorns were made to trouble him, and herbs were to sustain him outside the Garden of Eden. Moreover, the account is limited to the context of the Garden of Eden and not the whole world. Grains and barley, the Hebrew word is etzeb, may have existed in isolation, but fields of grain require cultivation, and man had not yet been created to cultivate the land. This was Cassuto's argument. Again, even in the garden, fields of grain may be in view. Grains and barley require man to cultivate it, but man was not there yet. What about the problem of forming animals before man in the so-called P account of Genesis 1, but after man in the so-called J account of Genesis 2? Well, there's several possible solutions. One solution is to say that in Genesis 2, that the creation of animals may be a special case for the Garden of Eden. Other animals could have already existed, but God made certain other animals for Adam to name at that time. Or another solution, and this is one that's adopted by the NIV, is to argue that Genesis 2 and verse 19 represents a flashback and should be translated as a pluperfect. And hence you could render it, God had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air. And if you adopt that translation, well, then that resolves the conflict. It's simply going back to what was previously described in Genesis 1. A third solution is that man as male and female are only made after the animals. In Genesis 1, it gives a simplified explanation. It says, where it talks about the animals being made and then man, male and female being made. But when it goes into the detail, it's a little bit more complex. So that some animals were made after Adam was made, but all animals were made before man as male and female were made. because they were made before Eve came along. And so you can explain Genesis 2 as giving a more detailed account, but it's not in contradiction to the earlier account. Well, with any of these solutions, 1, 2, or 3, there are no contradictions, and you can decide which solution you find most adequate, but there's no necessity to find a contradiction here. Now, source critics miss a phenomena in the text called synoptic resumptive storytelling, which actually explains some of the alleged contradictions and abrupt changes, but they don't understand it and they tend to miss it. Synoptic resumptive storytelling or resumptive repetition is actually a common storytelling style in the Pentateuch and even elsewhere in the Old Testament. The technique is to tell a story once, and then to flash back and retell the story, either to expand on the story or to tell the same story from a different perspective. And the source critics will wrongly see two conflicting or divergent sources whenever this happens. But this arguably is a literary technique by a single author akin to flashback. So, for example, you have in Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the synopsis of creation. Verse 1 tells the whole story, all 6 days of creation. But then the 6 days of creation that follow represents a resumptive and expansive telling of that same story, saying it in much more detail. Also in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. Genesis 1, 26 and 27 speaks of how God created man, male, and female. But when this is the synopsis of the creation of mankind. But when you get to Genesis 2, it's resumptive and expansive of that story, telling in more detail the story from a different point of view. Genesis 1 and 2 then are not two creation accounts, but one story using synoptic, resumptive, expansive repetition. Synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling takes place in Genesis 15 as well. It tells the same story twice to portray the event from different points of view. In Genesis 15, 1 through 6, it talks about after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Yahweh God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him. This man will not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look towards the heavens and number the stars if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. That's said to be a E account, according to source critics. But when you get to Genesis 15, 7 through 21, you get a very similar account. And he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Yahweh God, how am I able to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then it goes on to give the account of a sacrifice. Skipping to verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces of animal that had been cut in two. And on that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Kadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaim and the Amorites and so forth. Now, source critics see here a contradiction and two sources. They say, well, in verse 6, it says that Abraham believed God, but then in verse 8, he's in unbelief. Contradiction. And then in verse 5, it talks about how the sun had gone down. It was already dark with stars shining. But in verse 12, the sun is just now going down. So is it at night where you can see the stars, or is the sun just going down? And as the sun is just going down, you can't see the stars. So there are contradictions and therefore two sources, so say the Wellhausian source critics. The exact sources are somewhat debated. Wellhausen, though, thought that the first 6 verses was the E source and the rest of the chapter was J source. But all this can be explained without resorting to sources. And the argument, and Gordon Wenham argues this, the argument is that what you have here is resumptive repetition, where you tell a story once, but then you tell it again from a different point of view. So in Genesis 1 through 6, that's the first version of the story. It begins with a promise of reward. Well, that's how the second part begins, with a promise of reward. But then Abraham complains about lack of seed. But then in the second account, Abraham complains and wants some sort of guarantee. But then in the first account, a promise is given about an heir. In the second account, an oath right is commanded to give a guarantee. But then you have, he's taken to the open field and shown the stars, so shall your descendants be. In the second account, an oath right is carried out. And then at the end, you get a promise of seed, Yahweh's word. And then you get a promise of land, Yahweh's word. And then you have faith, Abraham believes God. And then you have the covenant confirmed, verses 18 through 21. Both of them have similar common features. Yahweh's word, followed by Abram's word, followed by Yahweh's reaction, followed by a public act, followed by Yahweh's word, and then a conclusion. And the argument is this: these are not two separate stories. These are one story told twice from different points of view. The first emphasizes seed, the first story. The second emphasizes covenant and land. And this resolves the contradiction. Verse 7 is flashback, going all the way back to the beginning of the story, when before Abraham had believed God and had been reckoned to him for righteousness. And verses 1 through 6 then gives the bottom line that Abraham believed in God, but then in the next passage it gives more details about how he came to believe God, and that this involved God's making a covenant with him. And thus the third pillar, from contradictions and divergence point of view, also proves to be unsound. Well, what about the fourth pillar? The fourth pillar is doublets. Do we have two accounts of creation in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2? That is argued as a doublet. And the answer is no. They're not really two accounts of the same story. but rather it's a synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling style to tell the same event twice from different points of view. The first giving you a general account, the second focusing in on man, and simply continues the story on. And there's no need to posit different sources on the basis of these two accounts. It's a flashback sort of thing. Well, what about the wife-sister motif? Well, admittedly, it's rather unusual for things to happen three times over the course of two generations. But it's not impossible for such things to happen. History is full of the improbable happening. Similarly, stories may reflect the purpose of a single author to draw attention to the similarities in the incidents and form a unified literary purpose by a single author. Whybray puts it this way: the repetition of what is basically the same story is integral to the literary effect intended by the author. He was deliberately drawing attention to the theme of God's preserving his promise to Abram by informing his readers that God intervened not once but three times to ensure the fulfillment of the promise of progeny. And so doublets is not a conclusive argument for this theory either. Well, what about the last argument, the last pillar from composite sections? Well, first of all, a general remark. Source critics in general destroy the aesthetic beauty of biblical narratives by assigning sections or even single verses or parts of verses to diverse sources. Source critics destroy beauty and the symmetry, beauty, and logic of the narratives. Well, let's look at the flood narrative. Source critics miss the coherent chiasm that's in the flood narrative that suggests this is not a cut and paste editing. Bernard Anderson outlines the passage this way, and look at the symmetry that's found here. Violence in God's creation, one, first divine address, second divine address, beginning of the flood, the rising of the flood waters, but then right in the middle, God remembers Noah. But then you have the receding of the waters, parallel with the rising of the waters. You have the drying of the earth, in parallel with the beginning of the flood. You have the third divine address, parallel with the second divine address. You have God's resolution to preserve order, whereas you have the resolution to destroy. And then it ends with the fourth divine address, the covenant blessing and peace, in contrast with violence on earth's creation. And so this is a chiastic structure, and this is the work of a literary artist and not cut and paste editing. Gordon Wenham has a simplified outline that also shows chiasm using the numbers. You have 7 days of waiting for the flood, 7:4, 7 days of waiting for the flood, 7:10, 40 days of the flood, 150 days of the waters triumphing. But then right in the middle, God remembers Noah. But then you have 150 days of the waters waiting, 8:3, 40 days of waiting, in 8:6, 7 days of waiting in 8:10, and another 7 days of waiting, 8:12, clearly forming a symmetrical chiastic structure. And Wenham comes up with a more detailed chiastic structure that combines some of these things, goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to O and P, and then all the way back again in parallel with each other. And you could pause the video and look at these and see how symmetrical they are. And so when you look at this fifth pillar of composite sections, it's going to be found waning. The writer has such a mastery over his material to produce these elaborate chiasm, it's no longer fair to refer to him as a mere editor. He's clearly an author. And there's no need to see contradictions in the flood story, since the chronology of the text is, in fact, inherently coherent if you simply assume the final form of the text. A few final remarks against the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis reflects an anti-Judaism bias. There was a anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish bias in Lutheranism of Wellhausen's day. And going along with that, Wellhausen preferred the religion of the patriarchs to the religion of later Judaism. In his mind, primitive meant good, ritualistic meant evil. And so Wellhausen preferred to see the original Mosaic religion as more primitive than the highly ritualistic religion we find in the Pentateuch's so-called priestly section. But this doesn't prove that he was wrong. But assuming that he is wrong, it helps to explain why he wanted to come to his wrong conclusion. Another observation, archaeologists have discovered this document, the Katif Hinon silver amulets. They were silver amulets with the priestly prayer of Numbers chapter 6. May the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace, and so forth. But we had in an earlier lecture referred to this because it has a quotation of some verses from the book of Numbers. Well, it turns out that those verses from the book of Numbers is a part of what Wellhausen calls the P source, which, according to Wellhausen, was composed after the exile. And yet we find it in an archaeological document before the exile, around the time of Josiah and Jeremiah, according to the archaeologists. And proponents of the documentary hypothesis thus have a contradiction from archaeology. Now, they could be saying that, well, yes, this silver amulet is quoting a verse which later was incorporated into that P source, and P is late nonetheless. But as far as the evidence goes from this archaeological find, it seems to contradict the hypothesis. So, how solid are the 5 pillars of the documentary hypothesis? Not solid at all. The whole edifice, when tested, collapses. Well, what comes after the edifice has collapsed? And we'll talk about that in the next lecture.